Hi, and welcome to the last video in week 13. Next week, of course, is the test, so please try not to leave the test to the last minute. It puts an additional stress on you and it might make it more difficult to complete it and to do well on it. Prepare your textbook, prepare your notes, and good luck on it. Okay, this week we're going to look at the second part of the chapter on population and urbanization. We're going to look at urbanization. And we're going to look at urbanization and the growth of cities and how urbanization affects growth in cities. And then we're going to look at the perspectives of urbanization and the growth of cities. And this is where we're going to look at the theorists and how they view urbanization. Not all theorists view urbanization in the same manner. And so, like in a lot of the other chapters, we're going to be putting our sunglasses on to look at urbanization and how do the different theorists sort of explore why that happens, and how do cities emerge. There's a whole study in this. In fact, part of my psychology degree was in community psychology, and we look at the makeup of communities and how they emerge to be the way they are, or how do people plan for them to be the way they are. So some questions you might, the other thing we're going to look at is sort of urbanization and the population as far as the future. Where might it go? Now, a couple of questions will be, how do functionalists, well, actually, we're going to rephrase this and say the ecological / functionalist. Functionalists take an ecological view when it looks at population, in particular urbanization. We'll look at some of the political economic issues regarding to conflict theory and how they differ in terms of the explanation of urban growth. Not all theorists see urbanization in the same sort of light, if you will. And then lastly, how do sociologists describe and explain the experiences of urban life? That will be the complete and final component in your Sociology 2 delivery. I hope you've enjoyed the class. I know it's been a bit of a struggle for some of you in your online experience. It may be your first one. I hope that you've learned something, and that if you choose an online class in the future, that you'll take advantage of what you've learned on how to be an online student. So good luck in your future. I hope to see you in another online class, and good luck on your future endeavors. Let's carry on, and good luck on your test. Bye now. Okay, now we're looking at urbanization and growth of cities. Now, I'm going to start with a definition of urban sociology. A subfield, again, of sociology that examines the social relationships and political and economic structures of a city. Now, particularly of census metropolitan areas, CMA, very large urban areas, and together with an adjacent urban and rural areas that have a high degree of economic and social integration with the urban area. And what you're seeing here is where the bulk of the population is. All those little red dots, you can see very few, but you can see concentrations of the red dots. This is where 80% of Canadians live. The rest of us live in all the white. So that's about 28 million people live where all those red dots are. And some of those red dots will represent consensus metropolitan areas. About 80% of Canada's current population live in cities, but there's the sort of area, give you an idea, that CMAs represent 60%, and 30% of the overall population lives in either Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver. And so you get an idea that urban sociology is also a fairly big study, because it involves a particular shift in people over the last few hundred years, where most everybody lived in the rural areas. Now a vast majority of the people live in cities. And so how does that happen? So let's begin to look. Now, if we go back quite a ways into the pre-industrial times, in ancient Rome society, there was an estimate of the population to be around 650,000 in the city of Rome. Now, what was, with its decline, there occurred a rustication movement, or moving to rural areas, moving out. Those who lived in cities, though, lived in walled cities to protect themselves. Now, part of what society at the time was characterized by was this sense of community. It was overcrowded. The basis for success were based on kinship and land. There was a high degree of social integration. These cities were always near rivers, lakes, and seas for transportation, for trade. In Canada, until the Canadian Pacific Railway, water was the only means of transportation for people and resources to move wheat, lumber, other goods and resources through water. Now, in industrial cities, now this is characterized a bit more by a lack of sense of community, the growth of factories, and emergent technologies, high growth rate in industrialized Europe. Now, because of factories and the ability to provide income for people, money to spend, it produced the likelihood of our increased birth rates. Now, in this period of time was the development of what we call metropolis, one or more central cities and their surrounding suburbs that dominate the economic and cultural life of a region. Now, these are all over the world: London, Toronto, Vancouver, where they dominate not just where the people live in those cities, they dominate the surrounding area. You know, the housing prices in Toronto and Vancouver don't just affect Toronto and Vancouver. They affect all the surrounding areas. The housing prices in Barrie have been going up dramatically as a result of people who can't afford to live in Toronto, but it pushes them out and they'll pay more because it's still lower than Toronto and the commute is manageable. So in industrialized metropolis, these became very dominant economically in terms of the cultural life of the region as well. Central cities are densely populated centers of the metropolis, so that as much as Toronto would be considered a central city of a metropolis, the surrounding areas of Oakville, even as far as Whitby, maybe even Oshawa, Markham, those whole areas are a part of what is known as the GTA. Then, if we move on to what are post-industrial cities, there's a decline of factories in an industrial, a decline of factories and industrial sector where you find more light industries, high tech, service industries, business and government, transportation centers, high levels of communication. And a lot of these cities are marked by that sort of degree of, if you will, success or shift in the way that they operate and are successful. Alrighty, let's look at some of the theories associated with urbanization, some perspectives on urbanization and growth of cities. And we'll start with the functionalists. Now, in this particular example, you're going to see this in your textbook. There are three models being looked at. Now, the functionalists go by in this degree or sphere of study as ecological models. They take it from a sort of the ecology of the environment moves in certain ways, expands and diminishes, and that's part of where the functionalists emerge from in regards to urbanization. And the theme here is that cities as meeting of people and their physical environment, that there is a pattern to the life cycle of cities. This pattern is in the form of concentric circles. Now you see this in the Model A, concentric zone model. Now I'm only going to review 5 of the zones for the concentric model. Zone 1 is the central business area, and there's the basic elements in this would be retail stores, financial institutions, hotels, theaters. That would be in Zone 1. Zone 2 would be wholesale light manufacturing and marginal businesses, things like taverns, secondhand shops, and the like. Zone 3 would be the working class residences. Zone 4 would be more the affluent and shopping malls. And Zone 5 would be a ring of small cities and towns populated by people who commute to the city to work. Now, on the concentric zone theory, there's a few other points that introduce here. Now, these zones don't remain consistent throughout time. There's some movements that can have, or shifts. One is known as invasion. This is the process by which a new category of people or type of land use arrives in an area previously occupied by another group or land use. And so you'll see this sometimes in some cities. They will annex property or lands that were at one point maybe low residential or small industrial or farm, get taken over for the city to build and develop new residential. And so that would be called invasion. Succession is another term that's used, and this is the process by which the new category of people or type of land use gradually predominates an area formerly dominated by another group. And so you'll see in this case it's less about an invasion. It's more of a creeping of one group of people into another area. Now the theory here, the zones move in and outward regularly. And one of the terms that's used a lot, you may have heard in news and looking at some of the sort of growth of cities, is what's called gentrification. And what happens here is this is a process by which members of the middle or upper class move into the central city area and renovate existing properties. So if you look at this model at this concentric zone where this central area was the business district, but you also had lower income people living there, what you start to see now, and then you look in Toronto, you go downtown in Toronto, it's less about where people used to live. I used to visit downtown Toronto when I was younger, in my teens, in the 70s, and there were a lot of low-income people living in and around the downtown. But now you go downtown and you'll find a lot of high-end condominiums. And that movement from one type of downtown use to another is what's called gentrification. Now the other model there is the sector model. And this emphasizes, the emphasis is on the significance of terrain and the importance of transportation routes in the layout of cities. And so this look uses the same zones, but is usually more designed around the terrain, the geographic area of a city. But it uses the same 5 zones, and it also incorporates, if you will, the same sort of elements of invasion, succession, and gentrification. Now, alternatively, when we move to the multiple nuclei model, here the focus is not on the radiation from the center to the periphery, like the concentric zone, and even like the sector model, but rather there are more numerous centers. Now, if you've ever gone to London, where you've got Masonville, you've got Wonderland, you've got these different areas, these are multiple nuclei model. You'll find this in Toronto as well. You can go to Yorkville, you can go to the downtown, you can go to North York, you can go to East York. These all have their own little nuclei. And so this is some of the differences that you see between Canada and the United States, is Canada has more multi-nuclei models than what the US does. So let's move along. We're going to move into conflict. And you remember with conflict, it's often sort of looking at the rich versus the poor. And in this instance, it's not a lot different. That growth of cities does not happen by chance, but by the decisions of political and economic elite. Now, as much as this depicts, the Renaissance time and Victorian time, this still holds true to today. An example would be the decision to reroute the CPR through Winnipeg. Today, a small group of rich, wealthy people finance the development of cities, and the effect is what's known as uneven development. And you see an example here where on one half you're finding very standardized housing, but on the other you're finding quite a high-end example, and that's what's known as uneven development. And this occurs because of the role of the elite group making decisions about how to make use of land. Now, the feminist perspective, it's a little different. The development of cities reflects not only the decision by the elite, but also the elite who are men. and particularly patriarchy. Now there's a couple of terms being used in this particular theory. One is the gender regimes, where the prevailing ideology of how women and men should think, feel, and act, how access to social positions and control of resources should be managed, and how the relationship between men and women should be conducted. So this sort of further delineates within a city what women should think, feel, and act within that city, and same for men. And it puts men in a more advantaged situation. Now, if you look at gender in the city life, essentially some men see the city as a sexual space. Affluent women may, in the city as a space where they can be protected by public officials, but there's a paradox. The city offers women freedom. Cities can also be very dangerous for women. And it introduces this term, the vulnerability of women, because most women with children are engaged in public labor. They need to go to places and work, and it poses them a danger. You just have to read the newspaper. You don't hear as frequently or as much about men being disadvantaged by physical attacks by women. You hear women being attacked and assaulted in cities, often by men. And that's part of the feminist perspective, is that cities does put women in a more vulnerable spot. Moving into symbolic interactionalists, the experience of city life is, they look at what the experience of the urban life is. Some theorists take a more positive view, and others a more negative perspective about how the urban life affects us. We'll begin with Simmel and Wirth. Simmel looks at city life as fast. It's much too stimulating for people, and they become insensitive to problems. If you go downtown Toronto, it could be easily argued that some people become so hardened or insensitive to social problems of poverty that they will walk over people who are laying on the sidewalk sleeping. Urbanites are weary of others. The opportunity for freedom is affected. And so sometimes if you walk down the street in Toronto and smile at everybody you see, you'd be surprised at how many people, one, don't notice you, or two, won't smile back. It's not because they aren't caring and sensitive people in their private life, but Simmel would argue that they become insensitive and they become weary of the kinds of stimulation that occurs within a city. Now, urbanism as a way of life by Wirth, well, urbanism, the distinctive social and psychological patterns of life. So how we live in a city is not the same as how we live and what we experience in the rural area. There's high division of labor. There's lower waged employees, there's mid-ranged employees, there's high-range employees. So there's a high division of labor in a city that you don't see so much in the rural area. Most people act in secondary groups. So when you look at groups in sociology, there's primary groups and secondary groups. Primary groups would be those people who you see as the most trusted people that you know, your family. You don't have a lot of really specific things to do. You do a lot for one another, whereas secondary groups tend to be more like work groups. People where you're goal focused. You have a reason for being there. You don't necessarily socialize with them outside of work. You might. And so it treats the social relationships that we have in somewhat of a cold manner. Now the third symbolic interactionist we can touch on is Gann. Here he looks at the subparts of a city and offers close social links and loyalties, that where we live in the city and who we associate with creates these social links. And we do have a sense of community. I remember as a young person going into Yorkville. Yorkville was very much a sense of community. They separated themselves from others. They recognized their uniqueness. But all communities tend to offer this in some capacity. So some of the examples were these cosmopolites, singles, ethnic villages. You go to Little Italy and Little China. But these ethnic villages offer a certain amount of being trapped, not being able to get out and move around as freely. So urban choices could be creation of urban subcultures. People have more choices. Different physical spaces invite different people. Now you have to remember that symbolic interactionalists are all about the face-to-face. So it's the meaning that those face-to-face interactions have. Now, until you live in a downtown, you don't have the face-to-face to develop that sense of community or that sense of separation of us and them. Now, lastly, we'll touch base on the postmodern perspective. The postmodern cities are quite different from modern cities as depicted in the concentric model of the functionalists. Instead, they move away into what is known here, and you see on here depicted as circa 2000, where there's a lot of variation in these zones. It's not as organized. That urban centers are much more diverse. They touch base on what's known as the fantasy city, where bars, restaurants, casinos, theaters, sports arenas are all likened to the downtown. It's a simulation of travel, common national businesses, standardization of facilities across borders and cities. They really look at it in a much more fanciful way that cities try to be something for people that they can't necessarily be. And so there's a number of things that could be included here. Inclusive will be these items coming up here. It's decentered, meaning that there isn't a central area. They're moved all over like the image in the circa 2000. Not a concentric system, but a collapse of consumption-oriented landscapes. Businesses popping up everywhere trying to derive a success. The decline in public spaces from private companies are creating large spaces that are not public anymore. Example, the West Edmonton Mall, and gated communities to keep the public out and create private spaces. All right. There we be. So if we're looking at the future, we have a lot of possibilities, and yet nothing is predictable, of course. Population growth will affect cities the most. They will grow more rapidly to the creation of what are known as megalopolises, a continuous concentration of two or more cities and their suburbs that have grown until they form an interconnected urban area. Increased use of natural resources, well, will there be enough for all? The problem with pollution, global warming, and the world trade agreements, it'll be hard to say how this will affect cities. So when we think in terms of populations, it's very difficult to predict, as many unexpected events can occur: epidemics, natural disasters, economic declines. But there will likely be a continued worldwide growth, continued decline in industrialized nations. Hans Rosling predicts about 11 billion max. Then it starts to decline, but by the year 2050, the populations in 45 countries, including Germany, Russia, Japan, will be lower than current levels, and yet other cities, like the ones that popped up there, are huge megalopolises. Fertility rates have also dropped significantly in poor countries. And so as much as what we mentioned, what was observed in Hans Rosling's video, that yes, the population is going to continue to grow, and maybe even as high as 11 billion before it starts to decline. But it's declining for specific reasons, and his video on population offered you, I think, some insights on that. All right, there we be, done and complete. Good luck, everybody. It has been a pleasure teaching Sociology 2 and in this online version of it. Good luck, everyone, and bye for now.